Hello. Is anyone there?
Good evening, listeners, and welcome to another journey into the shadows of yesteryear. I'm your host, bringing you a tale from 1952, when telephone operators connected every call by hand, and the night shift held mysteries that daylight never revealed. Picture, if you will, the Riverside Telephone Exchange on a cold October night. The building stood 5 stories tall on Maple Street, its windows glowing amber against the darkness. Inside, a dozen operators worked the overnight shift, their voices weaving connections across the sleeping city. Our story begins with Margaret Flynn, a woman of 35 who had worked the midnight to 8 shift for nearly 10 years. She knew every regular caller, every emergency number, every trick of the antiquated switchboard that hummed and clicked through the quiet hours. Margaret was reliable, punctual, and possessed of an unusual gift. She could identify most of her regular callers by voice alone. On this particular October night, Margaret arrived at the Exchange building at 11:45, 15 minutes before her shift began. The autumn wind rattled the windows as she climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, her heels echoing in the empty stairwell. The day shift supervisor, Mrs. Coleman, was waiting with the evening's reports. "Quiet night so far," Mrs. Coleman had said, gathering her coat and purse. "The usual late calls from the hospital district, and old Mr. Henderson called twice looking for his nephew in Chicago. The long-distance lines to the East Coast have been crackling something awful. That storm system moving through, most likely." Margaret settled into her position at the main switchboard, adjusting her headset and scanning the rows of switches and lights that would guide her through the next 8 hours. The Exchange employed 12 operators during the day shift, 6 in the evening, and only 3 through the night. Tonight, it was Margaret, young Dorothy Mills, and veteran operator Sarah Chen. The first few hours passed normally. Margaret connected calls between worried parents and college students, handled emergency calls to the police and fire departments, and put through several long-distance calls to California and points west. The autumn storm Mrs. Coleman had mentioned was indeed affecting the eastern lines. Calls to New York and Boston were filled with static and required multiple attempts. It was at precisely 2:17 in the morning when Margaret received the call that would change everything. The switchboard light flickered, indicating an incoming call from the residential district. Margaret plugged in her cord and spoke in her practiced, professional voice. "Operator, how may I direct your call?" The voice on the other end was elderly, female, and trembling with what Margaret initially assumed was the cold. "Operator, I need to reach the police, but not the emergency line. I need to speak to Detective Morrison specifically. It's about the Whitmore case." Margaret knew Detective Morrison by reputation. He handled the more complex cases for the city police. The Whitmore case had been in the newspapers for weeks. Robert Whitmore, a local businessman, had disappeared from his locked study 3 months earlier, leaving behind only an open window and a room that showed no signs of struggle. "I'll connect you to the police station, ma'am, and you can ask for Detective Morrison." But before she could make the connection, the woman's voice became urgent, almost desperate. "Wait, please. I need to tell someone what I saw tonight, in case something happens to me before I can reach the detective." Margaret hesitated. Operators were trained to connect calls, not to listen to personal conversations. But something in the woman's voice, a quality of fear that seemed genuine and immediate, made her pause. "Ma'am, if you're in danger, I should connect you to emergency services right away." No, the woman whispered. "They might be listening to those lines. But you, operator, you're just doing your job, connecting calls. They wouldn't think to monitor what I tell you." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind outside. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Eleanor Hartwell. I live at 1247 Oak Street, in the blue house with the white shutters. I'm 73 years old, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 45 years. I know everyone on this street, operator, and I know when something isn't right." Margaret glanced around the exchange room. Dorothy was handling a call 2 stations over, and Sarah was updating the logbooks. The steady hum of the equipment and the distant rumble of thunder created an oddly intimate atmosphere for this unexpected conversation. "What did you see, Mrs. Hartwell?" Margaret found herself asking. The woman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 3 months ago, the night Robert Whitmore disappeared, I saw something from my bedroom window. I should have called then, but I wasn't sure, and I was frightened." Eleanor Hartwell's story began to unfold in careful, measured words. She had suffered from insomnia for years, and often sat by her bedroom window in the early morning hours, watching the empty street and finding comfort in the familiar shadows of her neighborhood. The Whitmore house sat directly across from hers, separated only by the narrow tree-lined street. On the night of July 15th, Eleanor had been at her usual post by the window when she noticed unusual activity at the Whitmore residence. A car she didn't recognize was parked in the driveway, a dark sedan with license plates she couldn't read in the dim streetlight. But it was what she saw next that had haunted her for 3 months. "I saw someone leaving through the back door of the Whitmore house," Eleanor whispered into the phone. "Someone I recognized, operator. Someone who had no business being there at 2 o'clock in the morning, especially since Robert Whitmore was supposed to be alone that night." Margaret found herself leaning forward, drawn into the mystery despite her professional training. "Who did you see, Mrs. Hartwell?" Margaret asked. The silence stretched for several seconds, filled only with the sound of Eleanor's careful breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. Dr. Philip Ashford," Eleanor finally said. "Robert's business partner and closest friend. The man who found Robert's empty study the next morning and called the police. The man who told everyone that Robert must have climbed out his study window and run away from his financial troubles." Margaret knew the name. Dr. Ashford had been interviewed extensively by the newspapers. He was a respected physician who had invested heavily in several business ventures with Robert Whitmore. According to the published reports, their partnership had been highly successful, and Dr. Ashford had been devastated by his friend's mysterious disappearance. "But why didn't you tell the police what you saw?" Margaret asked. Eleanor's voice became even quieter. "Because I was afraid, and because I wasn't completely certain it was him. The streetlight only illuminated part of his face, and I'm an old woman with failing eyesight. But tonight, operator, tonight I saw him again." Eleanor explained that she had been unable to sleep due to the storm, and had returned to her familiar spot by the bedroom window. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, she had seen the same dark sedan pull into the Whitmore driveway. Dr. Ashford had emerged from the car and walked to the back door, using what appeared to be a key to enter the house. "He was inside for nearly 20 minutes, Eleanor continued. "When he came out, he was carrying something, a small suitcase or bag. He looked around carefully before putting it in his car and driving away. That's when I knew I had to call the police, had to tell Detective Morrison what I'd seen both times." Margaret realized she was holding her breath. The implications of Eleanor's story was staggering. If Dr. Ashford had been at the Whitmore house on the night of the disappearance, and if he had returned tonight to retrieve something, it suggested possibilities far darker than a simple case of missing person. "Mrs. Hartwell, you need to speak to Detective Morrison immediately," Margaret said. "I'm going to connect you right now." But Eleanor's voice stopped her. "Wait, operator, there's something else, something I noticed tonight that I didn't see 3 months ago."
Eleanor described how, as Dr. Ashford was leaving the Whitmore house tonight, the wind had blown open his coat. In the brief illumination from the streetlight, she had seen what appeared to be dark stains on his shirt, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The storm outside seemed to grow more intense, with lightning now visible through the exchange windows.
Mrs. Hartwell, I'm connecting you to the police station right now. This can't wait any longer.
But as Margaret reached for the appropriate connection cord, Eleanor's voice became urgent and fearful.
Someone's at my door, operator. Someone's knocking. Very softly, trying not to wake the neighbors. Oh God, what if he saw me watching? What if he knows?
The sound of soft knocking came clearly through the telephone line, followed by Eleanor's sharp intake of breath.
The knocking stopped.
She whispered.
But I can see a shadow moving past my front window. Operator, I think someone is trying to get into my house.
Margaret's training took over.
Mrs. Hartwell, stay on the line with me. I'm going to connect you to emergency services right now while keeping our line open.
But as Margaret reached for the emergency connection, Margaret heard something that made her blood run cold. The distinct sound of a door opening, followed by Eleanor's muffled gasp.
Mrs. Hartwell? Mrs. Hartwell, are you there?
Margaret called into the phone. The response came not from Eleanor, but from a man's voice, calm and educated, with the slight accent that suggested years of medical training.
I'm afraid Mrs. Hartwell can't come to the phone right now,
The voice said pleasantly.
She's had a bit of a fall, I'm afraid. Nothing serious, but she'll need to rest for a while. Who am I speaking with?
Margaret's mind raced. The voice was polite, professional, but there was something underneath it that sent chills down her spine. She recognized the tone from her years of connecting calls. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being in control, someone who was used to being trusted without question.
This is the telephone operator.
Margaret replied carefully.
Mrs. Hartwell called to be connected to the police. Is she all right?
The man's laugh was soft and genuinely amused.
Oh, the police won't be necessary, operator. Mrs. Hartwell is prone to, let's call them flights of fancy. She's been under a great deal of stress lately.
Margaret knew she was speaking to Dr. Philip Ashford, though he hadn't identified himself. The voice matched perfectly with the few radio interviews she had heard him give about his missing business partner. But now, hearing him speak under these circumstances, she detected something she hadn't noticed in those earlier interviews, a careful control that suggested a man hiding something significant.
Doctor,
Margaret said, taking a calculated risk.
you know who I am.
It wasn't a question.
Mrs. Hartwell has been telling stories, hasn't she? Stories about things she thinks she saw, but couldn't possibly have understood.
Margaret realized she was in a dangerous position. She was the only witness to this conversation, the only person who knew that Eleanor Hartwell had called to report seeing Dr. Ashford at the Whitmore house. If something happened to Eleanor tonight, Margaret's testimony might be the only thing standing between a killer and justice.
Doctor,
Margaret said, carefully.
I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Hartwell just wanted to speak to Detective Morrison about the Whitmore case. If you could help her to the phone, I'll make that connection now.
Dr. Ashford's response was measured and chilling.
I'm afraid that won't be possible, operator. Mrs. Hartwell has taken a sedative for her nerves, something I prescribed for her earlier tonight when she called me about her concerns. She'll sleep very peacefully now.
The implication was clear, though stated in the careful language of a medical professional. Margaret felt her hands trembling as she held the phone. She glanced around the exchange room again. Dorothy was still occupied with her own call, and Sarah was working on equipment maintenance at the far end of the room.
You are a very dedicated operator,
Dr. Ashford continued, his voice now carrying a note of what might have been admiration or might have been threat.
10 years on the night shift, isn't it? Margaret Flynn, 1425 Elm Street, apartment 3B. You walk to work every night, usually arriving 15 minutes early.
Margaret's blood turned to ice. He knew who she was, where she lived, her personal habits. This wasn't a chance encounter or a crime of opportunity. Dr. Ashford had been planning, preparing, covering his tracks with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to life-and-death decisions.
How do you know that about me?
Margaret managed to ask. Dr. Ashford's laugh was genuinely amused now.
Margaret, I've been a family physician in this city for 15 years. I know everyone, including the dedicated public servants who keep our city running through the night hours. I've treated your landlord's arthritis, your downstairs neighbor's chronic bronchitis, and the family of the woman who runs the bakery where you buy your morning coffee.
The web of connections was becoming clear to Margaret. In a city the size of theirs, a respected physician would indeed know the personal details of hundreds of residents. Dr. Ashford wasn't making a threat. He was simply demonstrating how thoroughly he was integrated into the community, how difficult it would be for anyone to believe that such a pillar of society could be capable of violence.
What happened to Robert Whitmore?
Margaret asked, surprised by her own boldness. The question seemed to hang in the air for several seconds, punctuated only by the continuing storm outside and the steady hum of the exchange equipment.
Robert was my friend, Margaret, my business partner, my confidant, the closest thing to a brother I ever had. What happened to him was necessary, but not something I took any pleasure in.
Margaret realized she was listening to a confession, delivered in the calm, measured tones of a man who had convinced himself that his actions were justified.
Robert discovered some irregularities in our business accounts, money that had been redirected from our joint ventures to cover some personal debts I had accumulated.
The story that emerged was one of gradual corruption and mounting desperation. Dr. Ashford had begun borrowing from their business accounts to cover gambling debts, small amounts at first, always with the intention of paying the money back before Robert noticed. But the debts had grown larger, and Robert Whitmore had begun asking questions about discrepancies in their financial records.
I tried to explain the situation to Robert. I asked him for time to make things right, to pay back what I had borrowed. But Robert was inflexible. He said he couldn't be party to any kind of financial impropriety, that his reputation in the community meant everything to him.
Margaret could picture the confrontation that must have taken place in Robert Whitmore's study 3 months earlier. Two old friends facing each other across an unbridgeable divide. One desperate to preserve his secret, the other unwilling to compromise his principles.
Robert threatened to go to the authorities. He said he would give me 24 hours to turn myself in voluntarily, but after that he would have no choice but to report what he had discovered. I couldn't let that happen, Margaret. I have patients who depend on me, a reputation built over decades of service to this community.
The justification was delivered with the same calm professionalism that Dr. Ashford probably used when explaining difficult diagnoses to his patients. In his mind, he had weighed the consequences and made the most rational choice available to him.
So, you killed him,
Margaret said, the words coming out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of thunder growing closer to the exchange building.
Robert's death was quick and painless. A sedative administered while he was reading at his desk, then a simple injection to stop his heart. He never knew what happened. It was the most merciful solution to an impossible situation.
Margaret found herself thinking about the practical aspects of the crime. How Dr. Ashford had managed to remove Robert's body from a locked study, how he had staged the scene to suggest that Robert had climbed out the window and disappeared into the night. As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Ashford began to explain. I had a key to Robert's house. We often worked late in his study, going over business papers and medical journals. I knew his habits, his schedule, when his housekeeper would be away. Removing the body was simply a matter of careful planning and timing. The details were delivered with clinical precision. Dr. Ashford had arrived at the Whitmore house late on the evening of July 14th, using his key to enter through the back door. He had found Robert in his study, working late as was his custom, and had offered him a drink to help him relax after their recent tensions. The sedative had been administered in the drink, a fast-acting compound that would render Robert unconscious within minutes. Dr. Ashford had then used his medical knowledge to ensure that Robert's death would appear natural, the result of heart failure that could be attributed to stress and overwork. Removing the body had required more elaborate planning. Dr. Ashford had brought a large medical bag, the kind he used for house calls, and had managed to transport Robert's body to his car in sections, making multiple trips between the house and the vehicle parked in the driveway. The locked study window had been opened from the inside to create the illusion that Robert had escaped through it, and Dr. Ashford had been careful to disturb nothing else in the room. When he had discovered Robert's disappearance the next morning, arriving for their scheduled business meeting, his shock and concern had appeared completely genuine. "Where is Robert now?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dr. Ashford's response was matter-of-fact, delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss a patient's treatment options. "Robert is at peace, Margaret. I ensured that his remains were disposed of with dignity, in a location where they will never be disturbed. The specifics aren't important. What matters is that a good man's reputation remains intact, and the community continues to remember him as the successful businessman and philanthropist he was." Margaret realized that Dr. Ashford's return to the Whitmore house tonight had been prompted by Eleanor Hartwell's phone call. Somehow the elderly woman had contacted him directly before calling the police, perhaps hoping to give him a chance to explain what she had witnessed. "Mrs. Hartwell called you first," Margaret said, understanding dawning. "She gave you the opportunity to clarify what she had seen before she went to the authorities." Dr. Ashford's confirmation was delivered with what sounded like genuine sadness. "Eleanor has been my patient for nearly 8 years," he said. "I've treated her for various ailments, helped her through the grief of losing her husband, provided her with medications for her insomnia and anxiety. When she called tonight, confused and frightened by what she thought she had witnessed, I felt obligated to help her understand the situation." The help, Margaret realized, had taken the form of a sedative powerful enough to ensure that Eleanor Hartwell would never wake up to tell her story to Detective Morrison or anyone else. It would appear to be a natural death, an elderly woman with a history of heart problems found peacefully in her bed by her concerned physician. "You can't keep killing people to protect your secret," Margaret said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Eleanor tonight, Robert 3 months ago. How many others will there be?" Dr. Ashford's response revealed the depth of his rationalization. "I'm not a killer, Margaret. I'm a healer who has been forced into impossible circumstances. Every action I have taken has been to prevent greater harm, to protect my patients who depend on me, to preserve the good work I have done in this community, to maintain the stability that benefits everyone." Margaret realized she was listening to a man who had convinced himself that murder was a form of medical treatment, the surgical removal of problems that threatened the greater good. It was a terrifying glimpse into how a rational, educated person could justify almost any action. "What about me?" Margaret asked, the question hanging between them like a challenge. "I know what you've told me tonight. I know about Robert, about Mrs. Hartwell. What's your solution for that problem? The silence that followed was longer than any before it. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could sense Dorothy and Sarah continuing their work at the other end of the exchange room, oblivious to the life-and-death conversation taking place just a few feet away. When Dr. Ashford finally spoke, his voice carried a note of what might have been genuine regret. "I am a good person, Margaret. Dedicated, professional, someone who takes pride in serving others. In different circumstances, I would be proud to count you among my patients." The implication was clear, though Dr. Ashford was too careful to state it directly. Margaret understood that she had become another problem requiring a solution, another threat to the secret that had already cost 2 lives. But Margaret had one advantage that Eleanor Hartwell had lacked. She wasn't alone. The telephone exchange was her territory, her domain of expertise. Every line, every connection, every technical possibility was familiar to her after 10 years of night shift work. While keeping Dr. Ashford talking, Margaret had been quietly manipulating the switchboard controls with her free hand. She had opened a secondary line and connected it to the police station, specifically to the emergency dispatcher's desk. Everything Dr. Ashford had told her in the past 10 minutes was being heard by the night duty officer. "Doctor, I think you should know that this conversation has been monitored by the police. They've heard everything you've told me tonight."
The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the storm outside and the mechanical sounds of the exchange equipment. When Dr. Ashford spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The calm professionalism was gone, replaced by something desperate and dangerous.
"You're lying,"
He said.
"Telephone operators don't have the authority to monitor calls for the police.
Margaret's response was steady and professional.
We have the authority to connect emergency services to ongoing calls when we believe a crime is in progress. Detective Morrison is already on his way to Mrs. Hartwell's address, and additional units are being dispatched to your location."
The sound that came through the telephone line was something between a sigh and a growl, the sound of a trapped animal realizing that escape was no longer possible. Margaret could hear movement in the background, the sound of footsteps and what might have been drawers being opened.
"Dr. Ashford,"
Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm and non-threatening.
"the best thing you can do now is to ensure that Mrs. Hartwell receives medical attention. If she's still alive, if the sedative hasn't—"
But the line had gone dead, leaving Margaret listening to the empty buzz of a disconnected call. Margaret immediately connected to the police emergency line, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Within minutes, she had confirmed that units were being dispatched to both Eleanor Hartwell's address and Dr. Ashford's known locations. The next hour passed in a blur of telephone calls and coordinated police activity. Margaret remained at her post, serving as a communication hub for the unfolding investigation. Reports came in sporadically. Officers had found Eleanor Hartwell unconscious but breathing, rushed to the hospital, where emergency treatment had saved her life. Dr. Ashford had not been found at his home or office, but his car had been spotted heading toward the industrial district near the river. A citywide search was underway, with roadblocks established at all major routes out of the city. It was Detective Morrison himself who called Margaret at 4:30 in the morning to provide an update. His voice was tired but satisfied as he reported that Dr. Ashford had been found at an abandoned warehouse near the docks, along with evidence that corroborated everything Margaret had heard during their telephone conversation. The small suitcase that Eleanor Hartwell had seen Dr. Ashford removing from the Whitmore house contained financial documents, medical supplies used in the murder, and Robert Whitmore's personal effects, items that Dr. Ashford had been unable to dispose of but couldn't bear to keep in his own home. More significantly, police had discovered Robert Whitmore's remains in the basement of Dr. Ashford's medical office, carefully preserved and hidden behind a false wall. The physician had been unable to bring himself to destroy the body of his oldest friend, keeping it instead in a macabre shrine to their relationship. Dr. Ashford had offered no resistance when police surrounded the warehouse. Detective Morrison reported that the man seemed almost relieved to have his secret finally exposed, as if the weight of maintaining his deception had become unbearable. Eleanor Hartwell made a full recovery from her sedative overdose, and her testimony, combined with Margaret's detailed account of the telephone conversation, provided prosecutors with everything they needed to ensure that Dr. Ashford would face justice for his crimes. The trial, when it came 6 months later, was a sensation in the local newspapers. Dr. Ashford's defense attorneys argued that his client had suffered a breakdown brought on by gambling addiction and financial pressure, but the carefully planned nature of both murders made it impossible to claim temporary insanity. Margaret testified about the telephone conversation that had revealed Dr. Ashford's crimes, her calm professionalism in the witness box earning praise from both prosecution and defense attorneys. Her quick thinking in connecting the police to the ongoing call had been the key to solving a case that might otherwise have remained a mystery forever. Dr. Philip Ashford was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He served 12 years before dying of natural causes in the state penitentiary, taking with him the full details of how he had managed to conceal his crimes for so long. Eleanor Hartwell lived for another 15 years, becoming something of a local celebrity as the woman whose sharp eyes and courage had helped solve the Whitmore murder case. She never again suffered from the insomnia that had placed her at her bedroom window on those 2 crucial nights. And Margaret Flynn continued working the night shift at the Riverside Telephone Exchange for another 20 years, until the old manual switchboards were finally replaced by automated systems that required no human operators to make connections across the sleeping city. She never spoke publicly about the night she helped catch a killer, considering it simply part of her job as a telephone operator, connecting people who needed to be connected, and sometimes, when circumstances required it, ensuring that the right voices reached the right ears at exactly the right moment. The Riverside Telephone Exchange building still stands on Maple Street, though it now houses a small museum dedicated to the history of communication technology. Visitors can see the original switchboards where Margaret Flynn worked, and a small plaque commemorates the night when a dedicated operator's quick thinking helped bring a murderer to justice. On quiet October nights, when the wind rattles the windows and storm clouds gather over the city, locals sometimes speak of hearing ghostly telephone bells ringing in the old exchange building, as if the spirits of long-ago conversations are still seeking their connections across the years. But perhaps that's just the wind, or the settling of old wooden floors, or the imagination of people who remember when human voices guided every call through the darkness, ensuring that help could always be found by those who knew how to ask for it. And so ends our tale from the archives of yesteryear, when telephone operators were the unseen guardians of communication, and sometimes the thin line between justice and injustice was nothing more than a wire carrying voices through the night. Thank you for joining us this evening, listeners. We'll return next week with another story from the shadows of the past, another reminder that truth like a telephone call, will always find its way to the right destination if someone is listening carefully enough to make the connection. Until then, remember that the night holds many secrets, but there are always those dedicated souls working through the darkness, ensuring that when help is needed, the call will go through. Good night, and may all your connections be clear.